He looked me up and down in front of 300 guests and said I didn't belong in that room. He laughed. His friends laughed. He had no idea who I really was. But in exactly 4 minutes, every powerful person in that ballroom would stand up. Just for me, before I tell you what happened that night, I need you to do something for me. If you believe respect should never depend on how much money someone has in the bank, type strength in the comments right now. And if you haven't already, hit subscribe because what happened at that gala changed the rest of my life, and I don't think I'll ever be the same person I was before that night. Now let me take you back to the beginning. My name is Simone. And for almost 6 years, I was Mrs. Whitfield, Preston's wife. That's how everyone in his world knew me. Not by my own name, not by anything I had built or earned before I ever met him, just his wife, the quiet one. The one who stood a few steps behind him at every dinner, every fundraiser, every family photo, smiling just enough to look pleasant, but never speaking too much, never taking up too much space. I got used to shrinking myself. I got so used to it that I almost forgot I used to be someone who didn't shrink for anybody. When I met Preston, he wasn't like this. He was warm back then, or at least he seemed warm. We met at a small conference years ago, long before his family's business exploded into the kind of wealth that changes how people walk into a room. Back then, he asked me questions. He wanted to know where I came from, what I believed in, what kept me up at night. But money has a strange way of rewriting a person's memory. The more his family's empire grew, the more he seemed to forget who I was when we started. Or maybe he just stopped caring to ask. His family never really accepted me. I want to be honest about that because I think a lot of you watching this know exactly what that feels like. I walked into rooms where people's eyes would linger on me a little too long, where conversations would pause just slightly when I joined them, where I could feel the question hanging in the air even though nobody said it out loud. What is she doing here? I was always polite, I always smiled. I told myself it didn't matter what they thought because I knew who I was. But here's the truth I never told Preston, not once in 6 years of marriage. I never told him because he never asked, and after a while I stopped offering. Before I met him, I had built an entire life of my own. A life full of work that mattered, work that took me to rooms most people only see on the news, work that connected me to some of the most influential people on this earth. I had walked away from that world quietly when we got married, not because he asked me to, but because I wanted to build something new with him. I wanted a life that was just ours. I didn't need anyone to know what I used to do. I didn't need the credit, I just wanted to be loved for who I was, not what I had accomplished. So I let that part of myself go quiet. I let him believe I was just a woman with a simple past, nothing remarkable, nothing worth bragging about at his family dinners. And for years that was fine with me, until the night of the gala. It was billed as one of the most important events of the year. An international gathering, the kind where diplomats and business leaders and people who shape the direction of entire countries all fill one enormous ballroom under one roof. Preston had been talking about this event for months. His family had worked for years to get invitations like this, and for him, this wasn't just a party. This was proof. Proof that they had arrived. Proof that they belonged among people whose names appear in history books. A few days before the gala, he sat me down and told me how he needed me to behave that night. Those were his exact words, how I needed to behave. He told me to keep my answers short if anyone asked me anything personal. He told me not to talk too much about myself because, in his words, there wasn't much to say anyway. He told me to smile, to nod, to let him do the talking. He told me this was a room full of important people, and he needed me not to embarrass him. I remember sitting there listening to him say all of this without even looking up from his phone, and something inside me went very still. Not angry, not yet, just still the way water gets right before a storm arrives. I said okay, I always said okay. 6 years of saying okay had trained me well. 2 nights before the gala, something strange happened. My phone rang late at night, a number I hadn't seen in years, and when I answered, a voice from my old life was on the other end. Someone I used to work with, someone from that world I had walked away from so quietly. They told me something that made my hands shake slightly as I held the phone. They told me my name, my real name, the one from before Preston, was going to be honored that week. Publicly, in front of exactly the kind of people who would be at that gala. I told them there had to be some mistake. They told me there was no mistake at all. I didn't tell Preston, I don't fully know why. Maybe some part of me wanted to see what he would do without knowing. Maybe some part of me was tired of explaining myself to a man who had stopped asking questions a long time ago. So I said nothing. I just got dressed the way I always did, simple, elegant, quiet, exactly the way he liked, and I walked into that gala beside him like I had walked into 100 rooms before, small and silent and holding my breath. The ballroom was breathtaking, chandeliers hanging like frozen light. Round tables dressed in white and gold. voices speaking in a dozen different accents, blending together into one steady hum of power and money and ambition. Preston walked in with his chest out, greeting people like he already owned the room, introducing himself to men whose names I recognized from newspapers, from television, from rooms I used to sit in myself long before he ever knew my name. And then it happened. One of his business partners, a man with a booming laugh and an even bigger ego, turned to Preston and asked about me. Simple question. Who is this? Preston's arm was around my shoulder, but his voice when he answered had an edge to it I will never forget. He laughed this dismissive little laugh and said something like, "Oh, don't worry about her, she doesn't really have much of a story, she's just my wife." The men around him chuckled, and then, like he needed one more moment of applause, he added something crueler. He said I was lucky that I had married up, that people like me didn't usually end up in rooms like this. I felt the air leave my lungs, not because the words hurt, though they did, it was the laughter. It was the way heads turned toward me, some amused, some pitying, all of them looking at me like I was a decoration on his arm rather than a human being standing right there, listening to every single word. I didn't say anything. I just stood there, my hands folded in front of me, my face calm on the outside while everything inside me went cold. For a moment, the entire room felt very small and very loud at the same time. I remember thinking about every version of myself I had buried to keep this marriage peaceful, every opinion I had swallowed, every accomplishment I had let go quiet so he could shine brighter. And I remember thinking, so this is what 6 years of shrinking gets you. A public joke in front of strangers. And then from somewhere across that enormous room, a voice called out my name. Not Mrs. Whitfield, not Preston's wife, my real name, the one from before. I turned and I saw a face I hadn't seen in years, someone from my old life walking toward me with wide eyes and open arms, saying my name again like it was something precious, something people around here should already know. The room shifted. I watched confusion ripple across Preston's face as this stranger embraced me like an old friend, like someone reuniting with someone important. And then another voice joined in, this one belonging to a woman I recognized instantly, a woman whose face had been on the cover of magazines discussing global policy. She said my name too, and there was reverence in her voice, the kind of reverence you don't fake. Words seemed to travel through that room faster than I could process it. People began turning, whispering, some faces lighting up with recognition, others turning to their neighbors to ask who I was and why everyone suddenly seemed to know me. And then slowly, deliberately, someone near the front of the room stood up. Then another. Then a small cluster of people at a nearby table rose to their feet as well until it wasn't just a few people anymore. It was rows. It was the entire section closest to the stage. Diplomats, ambassadors. People whose decisions shaped entire nations. Standing, turning toward me, some placing a hand over their heart, acknowledging me with a kind of respect that had nothing to do with who I had married and everything to do with who I actually was. Because the truth I had kept quiet for 6 years was this. Before I ever met Preston, I had spent years working behind the scenes on something most people never even hear about, quiet diplomatic work, the kind that doesn't make headlines because it isn't supposed to. I had helped negotiate an agreement that prevented a conflict most people in that room had only read about in briefings. I had done it without wanting credit, without wanting my name attached to it publicly, because the work itself had always mattered more to me than the recognition. That week, for reasons that had nothing to do with me seeking attention, that work was finally being acknowledged internationally. And apparently, in that room full of people who understood exactly what that meant, my name carried a weight I had never once mentioned to my own husband. I turned and looked at Preston. I wish I could fully describe the look on his face in that moment. All the color had drained from it. His mouth was slightly open, like he wanted to say something but genuinely didn't know what. The arm that had been resting so casually around my shoulder just moments before now hung limp at his side. The friends who had laughed with him were no longer laughing. They were staring at him with something between confusion and second-hand embarrassment, the kind you feel when you watch someone realize in real time just how badly they misjudged a person. I didn't yell. I didn't cause a scene, not the way he probably feared I would. I simply stood a little taller and I spoke, calm and clear, loud enough for the people near us to hear. I told him that for 6 years he never once asked me about my life before him. Not really asked. Not with curiosity, not with interest, not with the kind of care that makes a person want to share who they truly are. I told him that he had spent our entire marriage assuming there was nothing worth knowing about me, and that assumption said far more about him than it ever did about me. I told him that I had chosen quiet humility because I valued our life together more than I valued being seen, but that humility is not the same thing as having nothing to offer. I told him that a man who cannot see the worth in someone unless the whole world points it out for him does not deserve to be trusted with that person's heart. The room was silent, except for the soft sound of my heels against the marble floor as I stepped back from him. I didn't need to raise my voice for people to hear the weight of what I was saying. Sometimes the quietest words land the hardest, especially when the whole room already knows they're true. In the weeks that followed, our marriage ended, not in a dramatic explosion, but in a slow, honest unraveling that had probably started long before that night. Preston tried to reach out a few times, tried to explain, tried to apologize in ways that felt more about protecting his reputation than truly understanding what he had done. I listened because I believe in grace, but I no longer believed in shrinking myself to keep peace with someone who never bothered to see me clearly in the first place. As for me, I stepped fully back into the life I had quietly set aside. I didn't do it for revenge. I didn't do it to prove anything to Preston or his family or anyone who had ever looked at me sideways in a room I supposedly didn't belong in. I did it because that night reminded me of something I had let myself forget. My worth was never something that needed his permission, his approval, or his introduction. It had been there the entire time, patient and quiet, waiting for me to stop hiding it just to make someone else comfortable. Today I stand in rooms very similar to that gala, but I stand there as myself, fully without apology, without shrinking, without waiting for someone else to explain who I am. And every single time I walk into one of those rooms, I remember that night, the humiliation that almost broke me, and the moment it became the very thing that set me free. If there's one thing I want you to take from my story, it's this. Never let anyone's opinion of you define your worth. Never let someone else's ignorance about your life convince you that your life has no value. Sometimes the quietest person in the room is carrying the most power, the most history, the most strength, simply choosing not to announce it. And one day, whether it's in a crowded ballroom or in the quiet privacy of your own heart, the truth about who you are will rise to the surface, and everyone around you will finally have to stand up and see you clearly. If this story moved you the way it still moves me every time I think about it, please hit like, share it with someone who needs to hear it today, someone who has been shrinking themselves for far too long. And if you haven't already, subscribe because there are more stories like this one coming. Stories about strength, identity, and the quiet power so many of us carry without ever needing to prove it to anyone. I'll see you in the next one.